Hello, everyone. Redcoat here. I've got Dusty and Cientier with me.
Hello.
Hello.
So, we are finishing up the Highway to the Moon sets. If you've been with us through the last 4 podcasts, kudos. I thank you greatly for your listening ears. If you haven't, well, you might as well go check those ones out too. I think they're pretty interesting. But in any case, this is the last one. We're going to be talking a little bit about the level design of A Highway to the Moon, just the different levels, some of the things we were intending to do with them, and some of the challenges we ran into when making them. I think we'll just step through each level.
That makes sense to me. There are 5 primary levels. Real quickly, I'll summarize a bonus level that's in the game.
Yeah.
So we had a bonus level. I don't remember what the actual name of it was, but
Rainbow Rush. Rainbow Rush.
Okay. Developmentally, it's called Rainbow Road.
Yeah.
But a little bit of a Mario problem there.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was a bonus level where you'd fight specific bosses that were all thematically linked from the main game, with kind of a bonus official appearance from one of the final characters in that group.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of a boss rush level. With its own stylization and other things. So that was a bonus level that you could unlock for an additional bonus challenge, but not one of the main levels.
So yeah, you had the Rainbow Rush. It was an extra level. It had its own little things and dealt with some stuff on the boss side. If we go through the game kind of level progression-wise, the first level you encounter is level 1. The challenge of designing this level, or rather, I guess I should start with, this level was set on Earth, because the whole idea is that you're going up to the moon. So you actually kind of start out in about the troposphere is where I'd put it. You're above a canyon in the middle of a desert somewhere.
Yeah, you're kind of below the clouds, but above, a decent way above the ground.
Yeah, just high enough that it really hurts if you fall off, and that's the important thing. And the level itself was, we had there are a few characters that you're introduced, a few things that happen throughout it, but one of the main things there is that this is your introduction to the game proper. So the first portions of the level need to convey just how play works in the game.
Yeah, exactly. With the big key being communicating phase. We have a lot of mechanics that are fairly similar to other shmups, with a few other things added in on, like actual amounts of health. Which are familiar from most other games. So a lot of those sorts of mechanics are going to be expected. You can move around the screen, you can aim and shoot, and you can chest bump enemies for damaging yourself. But phase is a rather unique mechanic. It's not something we really see in other games. So we had to try to find a way to communicate to the player. So we ended up doing this through several different steps. The very start of the game, setting up the narrative progress, displays the main antagonist of the game, the Moon Man, going up and taking a few pot shots at you. This gets you the idea of you need to not just stand still. But it also lets us demonstrate the phase mechanic, because there's a bit of a gap in the road that the Moon Man and another character named Silva go over with their version of the phase mechanic. And then you see a regular enemy drive up into that gap and explode. So right away you can tell, road, problem, but there's something that people can do to get over it.
Yeah, or at the very least, you saw that those characters did something, got over the gap, and the dude ran into it. Like even if you're not quite catching on to that, there's something that they did to get over that. You saw that something changed on them.
Right. It's that process of inception, putting that idea in your head that there's something that happens. Right.
Right. And so from there, the play continues, and enemies show up and they start throwing bullets at you. It's pretty lightly paced when compared to the rest of the game. Then the Moon Man shows up again, and this time he's being chased by a set of dudes on a pickup truck.
Right.
And so he leads them off of the road, and then he turns blue and flies off the top of the screen. Now, note that I said he led them off the road. The road stops, and he's very clearly not on it. And then he just goes off in another direction. And Silva chases after him in that same color of blue. So this is the second, slightly more clear indication that they had to do something to be invulnerable above the ground. Now, as any normal player of a game knows, usually when you see a AI do something, you're not certain if you can do that same thing. But you just saw that happen, and it was a character that was shaped like you, so that gives the second inkling, right?
It significantly helps that both the Moon Man and Silva also ride motorcycles, so all three of you are linked together. You're also color coordinated differently. You're orangish.
Yeah,
Silva's more bluish, and the Moon Man is silverish.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly.
They stand out distinctly from the sort of orangish-brown palette of most of the enemies.
Yeah. And so after a little bit, Silva shows up again and starts throwing dialogue bubbles at you. Now, you might be that player that's holding the shot button, so you don't see all of the dialogue bubbles. But she's basically telling you about the thing that she just did.
Yeah, the phase mechanic. And there's one particular dialogue bubble that is completely undestroyable.
Yes, it is indestructible. There's nothing you can do to destroy it except for one thing.
Phase.
Exactly. That bubble says press whatever button, because we actually set it up so that it would detect which button you have set. Press whatever button to phase. And as soon as you push the button, it will go away. But the thing is, when you phase, you will turn blue. The same blue that Silva and the Moon Man turned.
Also, the same sound effects play. So there's an enter phase sound effect and a leave phase sound effect that is universal across all phasing actions.
Exactly. And so, with that, there's enough context made so that the player can make that connection of this allows me to go over things. Now, after that, Silva will throw more dialogue bubbles at you. Now, from a player psychology standpoint, after seeing that indestructible one and then pushing the button to make it phase, there's a lot less of a likelihood that you'll blow up those dialogue bubbles. But if you didn't, the next thing that immediately follows is a gap in the road.
Yeah. Now, the interesting thing here, though, about that whole encounter is that the dialogue is different depending upon whether or not you've phased up to that point in the level. If you've phased for a long enough period of time, then it's assumed you know that the mechanic exists and how to use it. So Silva just mentions, hey, you have a phase shifter, you're going to need that, and doesn't tell you how to use it because you have. That's one of those things where we don't want to trap the player in a tutorial that they don't need, but if they need it, we want to make sure that they have it.
Yeah.
And we ended up having to go fairly heavy-handed because the nature of the game is one that doesn't progress. Like, auto-scrolling games, like what Highway to the Moon is, are ones that you don't have a good way of having the player not able to constantly be progressing because the nature of the game is one that requires constant progression. So we actually spent a fair amount of time trying to figure out how to convey the concept of phasing to the player without trapping them, because we didn't initially have the technology to do so. We eventually just got to the point where we're like, the player needs to know how to phase. If they don't know how to phase, they will hate the game. They can figure out the other basic actions that are necessary to play the game. Any of the more advanced stuff they can figure out on their own. They just need to know how to phase. So we ended up putting in the effort to implement the here's the button you need to push, and until you do it, you can't proceed functionality.
And that was one of the biggest things in level 1. Like there were plenty of other stuff that happened in there, but that's a part of you can play the game and find out about those.
And if you're patient enough, you can also watch the dev play we'll eventually do of it.
Yes. Moving on to level 2. Level 2 is basically you're moving into the stratosphere.
Yeah.
One of the biggest things about that level is, so the game's ramping up a little bit in complexity. The road's going to be a little bit more difficult to deal with, and you're facing off against, you're basically facing off against the Air Force at this point.
Right. The level itself goes from just below the clouds, where you can kind of see some of the first early level of clouds, over an ocean, up through the cloud layer, and up to above the clouds. And it's got some really cool transition stuff that way.
Yeah. Now, the design of this level's roads was a little bit different than some of the others.
Right. So we had one of the other designers that we're working with more actively now, but came on to intern at the time, who built a lot of the road. But it was, I guess, I'd say around 3/4 built.
Yeah, we had there was still a portion at the very end that we had to add on to it, but the initial 3/4 of the road was built, and it was built in such a way. In the initial level, one of the things that we kept in mind was the idea that for any particular portion, if we want to lengthen it, we can just loop it.
Right. A lot of the game is built with what we refer to as looping sections, which is a section of the road that repeats itself over and over again until some arbitrary condition has been met. We have a variety of options for that. Most commonly is you've blown up a certain number of enemies or all of the enemies are destroyed. But one of the challenges that came up with this level is we had such a long section that we couldn't realistically loop any of it or it'd take too long to get through the game. There's a couple of areas where it loops, some for dialogue purposes. The very beginning also, to kind of set the stage of things, has a section that might loop on you depending upon how quickly you defeat one of the enemies there. And that's actually, just as a slight aside, speedrunning the game is a thing. Just because it's auto-scrolling doesn't necessarily mean that it always takes the same amount of time to get through. Skill will allow you to get through the game more quickly. There's a lot of sections that take different amounts of time depending upon the number of enemies, or like how quickly you destroy the enemies and stuff. But this level 2, in the first half of it basically, there's almost no loops because it's so long of a solid road section and it's not designed for it. So this presented a very interesting challenge because, as I mentioned earlier, one of the common conditions that we have for ending loops is you blew up all the enemies, which means that it leads to this very natural progression of spawn enemies, loop the level until the player's beaten all the enemies, move on, spawn next set of enemies. But you couldn't do this in this level because you have to be very cognizant of how many enemies are actually active, because when you spawn your next set of enemies, the previous set of enemies may still be around, so you could potentially overwhelm the player. So there's a lot of stuff for managing how long encounters were going to be lasting, particularly in any enemy that is going to stay around on the screen for a while, which some certainly did. So it was, how do you set up the encounters so that way the player's constantly having stuff to do isn't running out? Because that's one of the other things is when you move on to the next wave, when the current one's defeated, automatically the player is always having something to engage them, versus this where if you space things wrong, either they'll get overwhelmed or they won't be whelmed enough, as it were. Underwhelmed or overwhelmed. So it's a very interesting challenge to set up waves that were interesting and frequent enough to give the player engagement without lingering so long that they got overwhelmed.
That was one of the main challenges on level 2. I'll also make a shout out to our intern, Mr. Kageryu. He did an excellent job on the boss, Bart, for that level. It was
he drew the art for him.
Yeah, he turned out really well. Moving on from that, we get to level 3. Level 3 is probably one of the most intense levels in the game.
It's fairly stressful.
You know, looking back at it, it probably could do with a few more pickups here and there.
We, Redcoat and myself, Cynthia here, each did a playthrough of the game earlier today in preparation for this, because it'd been a little while since we'd played it. And level 3 was the level where both of us died for the first time.
Yeah. If you are able to push through the game and get past level 2 on your earliest run, level 3 is going to test you. It's going to chew you up.
It's maybe a little too hard.
Yeah. But that level, so one of the things that level had from a challenge standpoint, just from a design and development standpoint, was it was hyper-dense. And by hyper-dense, I mean there was a lot of subject matter. So this game actually does have a story to it.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of story, actually.
Yeah, like it's kind of interesting how much you can convey with just a few dialogue bubbles.
I remember writing the dialogue with you, and I remember making the dialogue bubbles, installing them.
Yep. One of the things that came out of that is that in this particular stage, whereas in the first level you had introducing the big bad, introducing the main boss of that stage, and then introducing Silva, and as well as introducing the mechanics, and introducing the first of the mid-bosses, or the leader squad. In this stage, you had to continue the story that was going on between Silva and Jake, whatever story it was, because it was either the one that happened when Red stood down, or the one that happened when Red was blown up, Red being the mid-boss of the first level. Then you also had the two members of Leader Squad that ended up being the bosses of this level, and them showing up and making sure that the player at least had an inkling that these were actual characters. They weren't just showing up out of nowhere. And the level itself was the satellite blockade, which is basically, so we've reached the exosphere.
Yeah, the level starts off with a lovely picture of Earth, courtesy NASA. Yay, public domain of government images, receding. So you have all these satellites in space because we finally reached space now.
Yeah, and the satellite blockade is, so in this universe you have, like, aliens are super crazy. Like, think of it like Men in Black. Just every day the Earth is about to get destroyed. It's just nobody knows about it. So you have this satellite blockade that's meant to stop aliens, and because of Jacob's phasing technology, it's all attacking him. Also, the Moon Man might have had something to do with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you pay attention to the story at all.
Incidentally, the Moon Man also shows up in this stage, so that's another thing that we had to keep track of.
Yeah, and you get finally a little bit of a taste of a confrontation with him.
Yeah. There were just a ton of different things that needed to happen in this stage, which meant there was a lot of content, but not only that, but that content also needed to not be repetitive. Because this stage very quickly becomes kind of boss battle the stage.
Yeah, because there's so many. Well, and the other thing that was kind of a challenge is there's multiple designers that were layering down encounters in this stage as well.
Because I think this one changed hands 3 times.
At least, yeah.
Yeah, because I remember we had whales on this one.
Right.
And then there was, I think I had you on this one for a little bit. I forget.
Don't remember if I did anything or not. I know you did the final layers on it, though. I might have done some additional work, though, because if nothing else, I would have at least done the dialogue encounters and the boss fight and the at the end and the battle with the Moon Man.
Yeah, and I do remember you did some work on that one in particular, because you also did the work on the final battle of Moon Man, so it made sense that you were involved on that. That whole deal meant that the design of that level kept on having to be reiterated upon for different reasons.
Yeah, and it ended up being very, very set piece heavy, I would say, in an interesting way, where you have some of that initial set piece of getting used to some of the satellites and being in space and all that sort of thing. Then you have a bunch of other set pieces that go on around it of different satellite features and things like that.
Yeah, I remember one of the things that I really wanted in level 3 was this. I wanted to make sure that space wasn't boring. And it's very easy for space to be boring. You can see it in many shmups where it's just like, we're in space, we have to do something other than stars to make this look well. And so for this stage, it was the satellites, and so really allowing that to permeate the entirety of the level was very important.
Yeah. Moving on from the density of level 3.
Is level 4. And so level 4, ostensibly probably the weakest level, I'd say. But.
Yeah, objectively, I think it probably ends up being the weakest level. It does continue us through space and takes us to the moon.
Yeah.
So we approach the moon at the end of the level when we're fighting the final boss of the level.
And I think this level also we put the nebulas in there.
Right, we put a kind of a nebula cloud effect to add a bit more interest. The first space level, which is level 3, the previous one, has a lot going on with satellites in the background, but those are all done and passed with by the time we get here, so we needed to add some visual interest to the parallax layers.
Yeah. Level 4 is basically Leader Squad's revenge, because in all the levels up to this one, you've beaten each member of Leader Squad, save for the actual leader of Leader Squad. And so...
Yeah.
She basically calls them in, and you have a grudge match with all of them, basically.
It's basically a contest to see if you're qualified to go after the Moon Man.
And so this level basically progresses in that way, where it makes heavy use of the looping idea, where you get to a sector and then you face one of the bosses and their minions, and then after you beat them, then you move on to the next one. One of the biggest things there was just making sure that we complete that cycle effectively. And put a cap on that story, because after that's done, you're not going to see those characters again. After that, we're just resolving the Moon Man angle.
Yeah.
And so I feel like the boss battle of the level puts a decent cap on there. It still has some work, but...
Yeah, and it's one of those things, any artist can look back at their work and say, well, here's where this brushstroke could have been better. There's a lot of ways that we can look at and say, okay, well, here's an area where the game could be a bit better. Here's an area where the game could be a bit better. And at some point, you have to say that the game is done, or you'll never
Never
be done
make
with
it. Yeah.
And that's part of what completing a game is all about, is calling it at some point in time when you say, okay, we have finished this sufficiently.
Maybe we'll revisit it at some other time if we remake the game in HG remaster, blah 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 later on. But until such time, it's done.
Yeah.
Move
Yeah.
on.
And as much as I'd like to go back and touch up areas, there's other things for us to be doing. So
Yeah, most definitely. I mean,
remaking that HG remaster. No.
the biggest thing with any title in a series, and this is something that also helps out in the future, is like if something does get good critical acclaim, then leaving those points open where you're like, well, we could have done that better. Now you have somewhere to go if you want to make a sequel.
that's true too. And the other thing is being able to kind of look at your own product that way, not that you think could be improved, but why and where, can help give you some understanding for some of the underlying reasons why. And that can be a boon to future projects. For example, with level 3, knowing that's a bit dense in enemies relative to the number of power-ups that we give you.
Yeah.
There's an area in particular that stands out in my mind as needs more health and also needs to end in a giant phase power-up. And that's an area where I can say, okay, I can see where we need to make sure that the player is prepared to face what we're about to present them in. We can't exhaust them of their resources and then not refill them before demanding them to use them again.
Yeah, exactly. So moving on to the last level, it's the coup de grace, it's the conclusion. You're on the moon, and the Moon Man is gonna fight you.
And you're going to fight him.
And so, I mean, one of the biggest things on this stage was it's a conclusion, it's a wrap-up, it's a climax. So that means that everything that we've done up to this point, first off, this is the difficulty level that we're bringing the players to. And then moreover, basically this needs to feel satisfying once you're done with it.
Yeah. Overall, I think this level is middle. Like, if I were to draw an arc, this would be the part where things start going back up.
Yeah, yeah.
But there's some areas where it's a little repetitive.
No, I can definitely agree with that. And it suffers from one of those things that happens with anything that's later on in your development cycle. You've got so many days and you're like, we want to finish this, we want to release this, but we also want this to be a quality product, and so you have to make those decisions about, okay, what more can we do here? Where do we put these things? How do we get them in there? And how many levels of polish do you go through and all that?
Yeah. And in the end, I think that the final boss fight with the Moon Man is one that is respectful of the build-up.
Yeah. Basically, it challenges you on all of the skills that you've done through the game. It challenges you on your targeting skills. It challenges you on your ability to respond to how bosses act.
Challenges you in staying on the road.
Yeah.
And it doesn't knock you off the road like it used to in the old
No.
dev build.
Yeah. And I mean, it does all of those things, and when you get to the last part and you're doing it all at once and you're fighting him, and it is really a challenge.
And then you go back and play level 1, and you're like, man, the hell? This is way easier.
And you will go back to play level 1 if you're an achievement completionist, because you have to finish all 4 endings.
Yes, it turns out there are actually 4 endings.
And you have to destroy all of the text bubbles.
Exactly. That's why you need to get all 4 endings.
At least if you want the Mula gun. That's a fun little
Yeah.
weapon. But,
I will shoot money at you.
The default weapon of the secretest of characters.
yep. If you can get a hold of that character, I have to give you kudos. I remember doing the speed runs to get that. It's hard.
I remember doing the testing to make sure you could get the achievement and finding you couldn't. And having to do interesting debugging to try to figure out what I was missing.
Yep. That brings us to our closing point. So that was Highway to the Moon, our first product, and some of the lessons we picked up from that. I mean, there are a lot of lessons we picked up from it. I think definitely one of the things that I learned as a designer was just like, planning's a thing. Planning's important.
I think that's something that that most of us have recognized, that it's really, really helpful to at least have some idea of where you're aiming and what you're going to be trying to accomplish. Now, that said, it would have been really hard to plan Highway to the Moon because we didn't know enough about how we worked as a group to be able to do so yet.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the other thing is, as Dusty had stated in one of the earlier casts, iterative design is also a very important thing. And really, at the end of the day, you want that mixture of both, where it's you have a clear idea and vision of, okay, this is what the game kind of should be, and some of the ideas of, okay, this is where the fun is, this is where some of these things are. That informs the development. You figure out as you're going along if that initial vision needs to change to match the rest of the development. It's a very fluid process.
Or if
Yeah.
the development needs to change to meet that initial one. It depends. Both directions work.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other things in my mind that were big lessons were more team-related ones. Things like communication and what makes for effective communication. The goal of communication is to be able to get ideas conveyed to another person. And some things that I struggled with towards the earlier parts of the development were trying to boast through communication, right? Trying to be clever or try to show off cleverness. And that's not serving the purpose of communication. It's to actually figure out what needs to be done or whatever. One of the other big things was learning to recognize other strengths and my own weaknesses. Redcoat, for example, has very good design sense for how the player is going to react to things, as well as holistic design skills, seeing how all of the pieces of something fit together. And that has strengths and weaknesses, and that complements some of my own design skills and abilities. I tend to be a bit smaller in my focus and look at things much more mechanically.
Yeah,
and whatnot.
He's a very meticulous designer in a lot of regards, and he has a way of rolling with the feel of a thing. One of my big things is I tend to have like, here's the plan, and then we get over here, and we just kind of walk through that. And with Sientir, it's more he gets a thing, and then he kind of rolls with it and massages it into what he's feeling it should be. It's kind of interesting, really, because in so much as I'm a designer and he's more of a programmer, our approaches are what you would expect of the opposite side. But yeah, definitely one of the other things is that concept of understanding your teammates and seeking that understanding as you go along.
Yeah, it really does help to get things along. And like one of the big lessons that I learned is, because of some of the senses that Redcoat has, where do I seed points to him, right? Like, I need to make my concerns known and that sort of thing, but I also need to respect sort of, I don't know if intuition is the right word, but sort of an intuitive understanding that Redcoat at least conveys about, well, this is actually very important. Like, it may not be something that you want to work on, talking from his perspective, but this is really important. And there are certain things with like making sure that we had proper tells, for example, on certain actions, where because I get so caught up in the straight mechanic of the thing, I don't think about the presentation as well. And because he sees how it fits into the whole of the experience, he has a much better feel for, okay, well, this is actually something that's really important to make sure that's in there. And that's something that sense of his and my eventual learning to acknowledge the value of that, because he was relying on me to implement stuff as a core programmer that I was, helped make the product a better product.
Yeah. And I know one of the things that I had to learn along the way was that concept of, well, there were two things. I mean, the first one was learning to actually ask in the first place.
Yeah.
That was a big thing. And then also really letting myself trust the rest of the team to take things to their natural ends and allowing their vision to evolve. I think the term that we always use is not George Lucasing it.
Yeah, which has to do with it needs to be a collaborative process, right? And the idea there is for people who are familiar with what happened to the original Star Wars trilogy, George Lucasing it is when you are deciding that you need to be the final say-all and it has to be your vision and nobody else's.
And to be fair to George Lucas, just because, I like being fair to him, even though I use his name on that particular statement. I mean, I know how those movies kind of went, and it was the thing of where it was not only that he was in that position of control, but no one really challenged that control either. And you want both. You want that idea of here's the core vision. This core vision is there is something beautiful about it. Now let's bring the other people in and draw that out and allow it to become even more, because that's really one of the reasons why you have a team in the first place. Is one mind can be great, but if you have like 4 of them and you actually pull all of those strengths together, you will make something that that one mind couldn't actually even conceive of.
Anyway, that's probably enough philosophy from us today.
Yeah, this is supposed to be more academic than philosophical, but maybe academics are philosophical. In any case, I'd like to go ahead and move on to the sign-off. So go ahead, boyos.
Boyo number 1, Ciantier, signing off.
Boyo number 2, Dusty, signing off.
And boyo number 3, Redcoat, signing off. Play the games you want to play, boyos.